주소 좀 가르쳐 줬으면 좋겠네요. 새 주소.
네, 잠시만요. Hello, everyone. My name is Taeksoo Kim. I am a composer, and it's my privilege to serve as the curator of this new music symposium hosted by the Korean Cultural Society of Boston. Today, we have a very, very special guest, Dr. Donald Reed Womack. He's a professor of composition at University of Hawaii, and he received the Guggenheim Fellowship this year, and that's one of his 100 commissions and grants he received so far. Also, nearly 100 works he has composed for orchestra, chamber ensembles, and solo instruments, especially including East Asian traditional instruments like hagum, komungo, kayaking, and voice. His music would be identified as intercultural music. His music blurs cultural and aesthetic boundaries, especially those in the East Asia and the West. His music has been performed by the National Orchestra of Korea, the KBS Orchestra in South Korea, the Seoul National Gugak Center Orchestra, and the Louisville Orchestra, the Hawaii Symphony Chorus, the Pittsburgh New Music Ensemble, Asian Art Ensemble in Berlin, the Salzburg Mozarteum String Quartet, and individual performers like soprano Tony Arnold and komungo player Yoon Jong-ha and kayaking master Ji Young-lee, who is also with us today. They're just, the list goes on, and I'm really, really excited, but I think it's better for us to welcome Dr. Donald Womack.
Thank you, Taeksoo, for inviting me to be here today. I'm very happy to be here on Halloween. Happy Halloween, everybody, and share some of my work with you. I will, since it's Halloween, I'll try to give you more treats than tricks. I'm happy to see several friends here, including E.G. Young, the fantastic virtuoso kayaking performer from Seoul, and my former student and friend, Marty Regan, who's joining us, I think, from New York right now, yeah? So let's jump in, and I want to start by listening to a little music, which will give you a sense of my sound. I think it's important that you know what my music sounds like before I start talking about it. So I'll play a short example, which will give you kind of a baseline for reference. I'm going to play a little bit of the piece actually that we heard as the introduction piece for those of you who came early. It's a piece called Intertwined, and it's for kayaking, viola, and changu. And E.G. Young is the kayaking performer on this recording. I'll play a couple of excerpts, just the very beginning of the piece, and then I'll play about the last 3 minutes of the piece. So give me a moment to share my screen here. And yeah, okay, so here's the beginning of Intertwined. All right, that's the beginning. I'm going to skip ahead several minutes and just play the ending, about the last 3 minutes of it now. I'll mention somewhat shamelessly here that if you like that piece, you can buy it on the album of the same name, Intertwined, which is available as a download or a CD from Albany Records. Just Google my name and Intertwined and it'll pop right up. So this gives you, for those of you who don't already know my music, this gives you a pretty good idea of what it sounds like. It's representative of my music in a lot of ways. First of all, it is very rhythmic. Uses highly developed rhythmic textures, multiple layers of rhythm, a lot of interlocking between the instruments, a lot of polyrhythm, and so forth. So very rhythmic. It's also representative in that it's very energetic and driving in character, like a lot of my music. It uses a lot of repetitive structural processes, so additive processes where I'll gradually add elements to build a passage, or sometimes the opposite, subtractive processes where I'll gradually take elements away to diminish a passage. This piece uses a harmonic language that is very similar to most of my music. It's essentially tonal, but a completely non-functional tonality that uses a lot of slow moving tonal areas. It stays in one tonal area for a long time, then it'll change to another tonal area. It typically has a lot of chromaticism sort of surrounding and decorating more stable notes. It's typical of my music in that it focuses on scoring and a nuance of color. It uses a lot of glissando. It uses a lot of pitch bending, a lot of pitch decoration, sort of playing between the notes, like between the keys of the piano, microtones, if you want to think of it that way. It's typical of my music in that it uses teleological structures or goal-oriented structures, a lot of dramatic gestures, building to climaxes and arrival points, creating characters and moods, so there's a clear contrast between sections and so forth. And finally, the thing that you're all waiting for me to say, it uses intercultural elements, in this case, Korean instruments. A lot of my music uses intercultural elements, and I've written close to 50 pieces for Korean, Japanese, and Chinese instruments. What interests me about this is the places where this material intersects with my own compositional interests, where I can find something in these intercultural elements that I might do anyway, right? And I can then take those and filter them sort of through my own compositional process, develop them through the prism of 21st century compositional devices, right? So I'm really looking in my intercultural work, I'm looking for places that intersect with things that I'm already interested in as a composer. Since I suspect it's probably this last point that would be most interesting for you, I'm going to focus this talk mainly on that, how I use intercultural elements in my music, specifically using several of my works for Korean instruments as examples, of course. In addition to the characteristics that I just mentioned, another thing that's important to my work is that I often find it very useful to have some kind of extra musical association. That can take many forms, such as a painting, an image, a poem, a story, a mythological character, basically anything that has a distinct idea to it, which I can then base the musical character on. So in the case of the piece we just heard, I took this idea of these string instruments, Kayaking and viola, being intertwined, so melding together, interlocking rhythmically so that they create kind of an electric, buzzing, and energized texture. In the case of the next piece I'm going to play, I found inspiration in Korean mythology, specifically the Imugi, which is kind of a less familiar mythological character, I think. Imugi is a proto-dragon, a young dragon waiting to blossom into maturity. And it's not all that well known even in Korea, I think. While dragons are obviously a big part of East Asian mythology and culture, Imugi, the young developing dragon, is unique. As far as I know, it exists only in Korean mythology, not Chinese or Japanese. Imugi are supposedly large serpent-like creatures that dwell in dark spaces, quietly, patiently awaiting the opportunity to become a full dragon. I think they have to wait like 1,000 years and go through these trials and so forth before they can become a real dragon. The piece I'm going to play, which is called Imugi, came about as a commission from the Seoul Piri Ensemble a couple of years ago. This was a newly formed group made up of students and recent graduates who were just starting their professional careers. And they wanted to commission a piece that not only gave them some repertoire to play, but also kind of staked out a place for them in the kugak world, something that could help them make their mark, distinguish themselves. So I was thinking about what I could write for them, doing a little research, trying to find some extra musical idea that was appropriate for the piece. And I came across this mythological Imugi, which struck me as a perfect metaphor for the group. Imugi, the proto-dragon, is a nation state, young, growing, waiting patiently to blossom into the full maturity of a powerful dragon. The character traits that Imugi has, patience, perseverance, determination to reach its full potential, those are exactly the same as these young musicians, right? So just like the young Imugi represent future dragons, these young musicians are future leaders, metaphorical musical dragons, if you will, who will go on to shape their world. So I took that idea as metaphor for the piece. Extra musical idea aside, I'm going to play it for you, and you can listen for the major features of the music, a lot of which we heard in the previous piece. In particular, notice the importance of various rhythmic devices, the emphasis on gradually building up layered textures to work with the structure on building toward these big climactic points of arrival. So let me play for you Imugi, which is about 10 minutes long. Next, I'd like to play some excerpts from a concerto for Hegum and Kugak Orchestra called Dancing with Spirits. This piece shows another approach I sometimes take to using extra musical elements. In this case, rather than using mythology as a starting point, I used a real world element of Korean culture, shaman ritual or gut. The orchestra that commissioned the piece in 2014, the Busan National Kugak Center Orchestra, Gung Busan Kugakwan, asked me to base the piece on a specific shaman ritual, Donghyun Byoshingut, which is a ritual practiced in fishing villages along the east coast of South Korea and areas near Busan. It's an old tradition dating back centuries in one form or another, but one that's still very much alive today. It's basically a ceremony in which a shaman blesses something like a family or a village, serving as an intermediary with the spirit world. It can last anywhere from several hours to several days. And in one case, in one sense, it's like a big party. The shaman, or mudang as she's known in Korean, she dances and sings, she tells stories, leads prayers, does all kinds of things, supported by a group of musicians, which is usually very heavily oriented toward percussion instruments. Here are a couple of short video excerpts of a gut, just to give you an idea of what the real thing is like. Here we go. That gives you a pretty good sense of it. It's really energetic. It goes on for hours and hours like that, sometimes days. Honestly, I don't know how they do it. They must just be absolutely exhausted afterwards. It's pretty amazing. So I was commissioned by the Busan Kugak Center to write a piece based on Byoshingut. And after researching it for a few weeks, I came up with the idea of writing a concerto in which the Hegum soloists would play the role of the mudang. I wrote it as 8 different scenes, and I'll play some of them for you now. You may have noticed the importance of drums in the previous couple of pieces I played, because Cheonggu, the main Korean drum, is so important in Korean music, especially in various genres of folk music like gut. Most of this piece has drum accompaniment as well. So gut typically begins with a rite of purification. And so the first movement of my piece depicts the purification through a series of what I call dirty passages, sort of crunchy, harmonic dissonant passages that eventually work their way till they arrive on a pure sounding open fifth, which is to sort of musically represent the idea of having been cleansed, after which the soloist comes in and begins interacting with the audience. So here's the first movement of Dancing with Spirits. Sorry, the video is freezing up here. I noticed a question in the chat. Someone was asking about how many people are playing this. Was there a conductor? I think that question was referring to Imugi, which was the Seoul Period Ensemble. And I believe there are around 20 or so people playing that. And yes, it was conducted. This piece is an orchestra piece. There are probably 40 to 50 members of the orchestra, and it is also conducted as well. So let me jump ahead to the third movement of this piece, which is called Shaman Dances. And this movement uses a very graceful rhythmic character that's typical of Korean dance. You can feel the round, circular type rhythmic motions as the shaman might be dancing in the ceremony. Jump ahead to the fifth movement now, which has a different character. This movement is called Drums and Gongs, and it's focused on the percussion. It's very wild and chaotic, much like certain parts of the actual Dongyeon Gyeoshingut ritual are. Here's an excerpt from it. And the climax of the whole piece is the seventh movement, which is called Dancing with Spirits. In this movement, the Mudong gradually dances herself into a frenzy, becoming more and more excited. Eventually, she reaches a state of ecstasy where she can sort of communicate with the ancestral spirits, but she's only able to remain there on this kind of metaphysical plane a short time, and she comes falling back to her normal plane of existence at the end. So here is most of the last movement. So that gives you an idea of my Hegum Concerto, and I'm happy to see Yunjae Lee here in our meeting. Yunjae, who himself is an excellent musician and a conductor of the group Ensemble 212 in New York, and he actually gave the premiere, the US premiere of this piece in the Western Chamber Music Orchestra version in New York City, what, about 3 years ago, I think, yeah. So welcome, Yunjae. I see in the chat a question about what attracted me to East Asian music, which is a great question. I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna hold off until the Q&A session on that, because that deserves a lot of time to talk about that. So next, I'd like to play another concerto or movement from another concerto. This is my first concerto for Kayaking and Kugak Orchestra, which is called Scattered Rhythms. And as you're listening to this piece, I'm going to point out that the soloist is right here in the Zoom meeting, Ji Young Yi, who is just a phenomenal player, as you will hear in this performance here. So the title of this piece refers to sanjo, which is the most important instrumental genre of traditional Korean music, sort of like sonata is to Western music. You can have a violin sonata, a cello sonata, a clarinet sonata, etc., which pairs that instrument with an accompanying instrument, usually piano. In sanjo, you can have a kayakum sanjo, piri sanjo, kumungo sanjo, etc., which pairs that instrument with a drum, usually jangu as the accompanying instrument. Sanjo is based on a sequence of changdan or rhythmic patterns, so it's very much a rhythm-based genre. The word sanjo itself means scattered melodies, and that brings us back to my title, Scattered Rhythms, which makes reference both to sanjo and to the importance of rhythm in my piece. The inspiration for the first movement, which I'm going to play for you, and remember that I often like to use some kind of extra musical idea. The inspiration for this movement comes from another ceremony, the Zhongmyo, which has its roots in ancient China, or more accurately, rather than the ceremony itself, the inspiration for my piece comes from a centuries-old account of the ceremony, which described the drums as being so powerful that their sound could be heard beyond heaven. I thought this was a very striking idea, no pun intended. So I poeticized the description a bit into the title of my first movement, The Sound of Drums Echoes Beyond the Heavens. So I'm going to play you the whole first movement here. Again, notice the importance of rhythm and creating a driving character throughout the piece, not just the rhythm and the drums themselves, but in the soloist and orchestra as well. And again, remind you that E.G. Young is performing this. This is the National Orchestra of Korea. So I have to give a huge applause for E.G. Young, who just a phenomenal performance here. I'm in awe of how fantastic a performer she is, as you heard right there. The next piece I'll play is like the first piece, another trio that mixes Korean and Western instruments, in this case, Haegum and Jonggu with cello. This piece is a good example of how I combine not just Korean and Western instruments, but Korean and Western musical aesthetics as well. It makes subtle reference to various genres such as sanjo and pansori, but it also has kind of a funky quality to it, which I think is an interesting mix with the Korean instruments. This piece is called Sori, which simply means sound. So it's more focused on an abstract musical approach rather than an extra musical idea like the other pieces I played. Again, though, in this piece, notice the importance of rhythm and creating a driving, energized character and this sort of funky quality to it. So here's a short excerpt from the piece. I see a question there. Is Haegum picked up by microphone? No, that performance was not mic'd at all. The Haegum is very good at projecting sound, especially this particular Haegum player who I happen to see in our Zoom meeting right now, Yo Soo-yeon. Hi, Soo-yeon. So yeah, she did a great job with that piece there. She was also the soloist on the Haegum Concerto when we played it in New York a few years ago too. So I'm going to make another shameless plug here. This is actually the same one as before. If you like that piece, it's also on the CD Intertwined. Just Google it and if you're interested. So I want to play one last piece. I'd like to close with a piece that uses no explicit Korean elements apart from the instruments themselves. This piece is called Labyrinth, or Miro, and it's for Kayaking quartet. It uses the modernized 25-string Kayaking rather than the traditional Sanjo 12-string instrument that we heard in the other pieces. This performance is by the Seoul Kayaking Ensemble, which commissioned the group several years ago. And it has a cool video to go with it, which was just recently produced by the National Kugak Center. Again, it's called Labyrinth, and it's all about the idea of creating sort of a confusing maze through which the instruments have to find their way out of before they can finally become free and clear. To achieve that effect, that sort of confusing, which way do I go? I approach the ensemble in a way that blurs the distinction between the instruments. So it's almost as if rather than 4 individual instruments, you're hearing one large super Kayaking, because they're constantly interlocked and intertwined. And any one part by itself makes no sense, but it all fits together to sort of become the key to how to escape the labyrinth. So I'm going to, because this video was giving me problems freezing up earlier, I'm going to share it straight from YouTube. I think that's probably going to work better. If I can find it, here we go. So this is Miro, or Labyrinth. So I will point out that the performers there are all students of E.G. Young, who is with us right here, and they just did a phenomenal job. Ji Young is an amazing teacher. She has so many amazing students, and these performers just were phenomenal in this. You'll notice they played it from memory, right? Of course, the sound with this was done in a studio, but they really did memorize it. They really were playing it while they were being filmed as well. I suspect that because the piece is so complex in terms of the interlocking nature of it rhythmically, that they had to rehearse it so much, but they probably couldn't help but memorize it, right? Just because they had performed it so much. But terrific job by them, and cool video. I love the video that the National Kugak Center made to go with that. So that's all I've got. That's a basic introduction to my music for Korean instruments in particular. It's been my pleasure to share my work with you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Wow, fabulous music, amazing performances, and great video production. Wow, just wow. So yeah, why don't we begin with the questions we already received? There was a question about from Byung.
I think he was asking how I came to be interested in East Asian music, right? And Korean music in particular.
Yes.
So I moved to Hawaii. I'm originally from Tennessee, and I moved to Hawaii in 1994. Wow, almost 27 years ago now, for a job at the University of Hawaii. And for those of you who might know Hawaii, it's a very diverse intercultural place, right? It's halfway between America, the mainland, and Asia geographically, but it's also halfway there culturally as well, right? So there's a very strong influence of East Asian cultures here, going back for over 100 years from immigrants and so forth. So I was immediately immersed in sort of this new to me culture, which I found very interesting. Still, it didn't occur to me to sort of do anything musically until almost 20 years ago. I had a couple of students, one of whom is right here, Marty Regan, who came to the University of Hawaii for a graduate program. And the other one is Yoko Sato, who was Japanese. And Marty had a lot of experience in Japan already at that point. And he had worked with a very well-known composer, Minoru Miki, who has since passed away about 9 years ago. But they introduced me to Miki, and Miki asked me to write a piece for one of his groups. And at first I thought, why would I do that? What are you talking about, right? But I did it, and I was like, hey, this is actually pretty cool. I like this a lot. There's some interesting things that you can do with these instruments. It was actually for 2 Japanese instruments and a Chinese instrument, which was kind of a weird combination to begin with. Pipa, the Chinese lute, and koto, which is the Japanese version of kayaking, and shakuhachi, which everybody knows, of course. And I started realizing when I'm, my approach to music is really instrument based. I want to write what works for the instrument, right? I'm very much focused. It's not that I want these pitches and these rhythms. No, I want something that sounds good on this instrument, right? So as I was learning what those instruments could do, I was realizing there are all kinds of things they can do that Western instruments aren't really very good at. In my introduction, I've written many pieces for Japanese instruments and for Chinese instruments, but about maybe 12 years ago, E.G. Young, who's right here, visited the University of Hawaii and gave a presentation on kayaking. And we talked, and she asked me to write a piece for her. And that was sort of my introduction to Korean music. And E.G. Young has been a great supporter of my work, and has introduced me to many other great musicians in Korea, and has helped disseminate my music. I think she forces her students to play my music. So that's kind of how I got into it. But what's interesting for me, again, I like to find these places that sort of intersects with what I'm interested in already. And in the case of Korean instruments, Korean music, kugak, is really very, very rhythmically charged, right? Especially the folk genre, sanjo. It's got really cool rhythms to it, right? And I've always been interested in rhythms. So the instruments are kind of built for that, in a way that violin is not really built for that. And I'm really interested in the sliding and bending and sort of between the notes, microtonal kind of sounds, which again, Korean instruments are just naturally good at that sort of thing. Korean instruments are built for that sort of nuance in the pitch and sort of nuance in the color and the timbre in a way that Western instruments are. Western instruments are great, don't get me wrong. I love Western instruments. I write for Western instruments. They can do fantastic things. They can do a lot of things that Korean instruments aren't very good at. But it goes the other way too. Korean instruments can do a lot of things really well that Western instruments aren't good at. If you take, for example, piano versus kayaking, they aren't the same thing at all, right? So piano is built to be very, very accurate in terms of pitch, right? As long as it's in tune, it's going to be perfect pitch-wise. But you can't do all that much with the timbre of it, and you're locked into those pitches. Kayaking, on the other hand, is not built to be accurate on pitch at all, but it's got so much nuance that it can do between the notes of the piano, right? So they're really different things, and I love what Korean instruments can bring to me to sort of work with the sounds in my music. And that's the short answer of how I got into it.
That's wonderful. And yes, you emphasized like how you know the instruments very well, but how did you become so like knowledgeable about the instruments? What's your process of collaboration? And is it like you met Jiyoung Lee and then she just exude some like a chi or something? How did you learn all about this?
Yeah, she just blessed me with her knowledge. First of all, I mean, I don't want to pretend that I'm all that knowledgeable. There are many things I don't know. I do not consider myself an expert on Korean music by any stretch of the imagination. There are many gaps in my knowledge. But I think I'm just sort of naturally attuned, as I said, to what the instruments, the sounds that the instruments make. And I try to be very idiomatic in the approach to them and just do things that they do well, right? If you're trying to write a lullaby, you're probably not going to use snare drum for it, right? So that's an extreme example, but the same basic idea. You write to the strengths of the instruments, right? So no matter what instrument I'm writing for. As far as collaboration, I have been blessed with opportunity to collaborate with many great musicians in Japan, in China, and especially in Korea. And for me, the collaborative process is really important because, as I said, my interest is in writing well for the instrument. And to do that, I've got to get the feedback from the performers, right? So I'm always asking performers, can you do this? What does it sound like if you do that? Is there a better way to get that sound, right? So for me, the feedback from the performer while I'm writing a piece is really important. And I've been lucky enough to have performers who are eager to collaborate.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And you just not only work with the performer, but you also perform the Janggu. That was really impressive. And okay, how did you get to learn Janggu, and how much time did you take? That's a Jean Ann's question.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to tell you my secret. I'm really faking it. I'm really not very good at Janggu. So, I mean, okay, I can hit the drum, I can play the rhythms that I wrote, right? But so as far as the technical level, I'm really at a very low technical level. I cannot play traditional music, right? And when I hear myself play, yeah, I'm accurate, right? But when I hear a real Janggu player playing my music, it's like, whoa, that sounds really good, right? Because they're just, 10 levels above me. So thank you, but I'm honestly really not that good.
Okay, there's one very technical question. What was the overall beat pattern of the Kayaking Concerto we heard?
Yeah, it's constantly changing. So the meters are constantly shifting in there. I don't know, I probably use 17 different meters and 5 of them going on at any given moment, right? Because there's a lot of different polyrhythms. So rhythmically, it's quite complex, but I always try to do it, especially for orchestra, in a way that that simplifies it as much as possible. So I'm not interested in writing music that is difficult to play, although usually my music is difficult to play. That's not what I'm aiming for. What I'm aiming for is this sound that has a lot of energy to it, right? And the way that I get that is through these complicated cross rhythms in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I was about to yell at you like that's a lie because that sounded really, really difficult. But so is the energy, can I understand it in that like the energy is what's resonating with your personality in
Yeah,
Asian music?
that's one part of it, certainly. Yeah. A lot of
Hmm.
my music, I like this driving, energetic character, right? Whether I'm writing for Asian instruments or Western instruments, doesn't matter, right? That's just part of what I'm interested in as a composer. And the instruments, especially like the plucked instruments like Kayaking, Kamungo, they're really good at creating these sort of multi-rhythmic layered textures that I like to use, right? So they work very well. That's another place where they intersect with my compositional interests.
Great. Um, so let's just talk about, I mean, it's so positive, so inspiring, but was there any challenge for you to write something that is not familiar to you?
Always, yeah. And I assume you mean when I'm first starting out writing for the instruments, yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, it takes a while to get used to it. Basically, you have to learn the language of the instrument in a way, right? You have to learn what works for it, the sounds, what sounds good on it, what doesn't sound good on it. And that going back to that very first piece that I wrote while Marty was a student here, I remember one day I was working on the piece, and I had written a note. I was showing it to Marty, and I had written. Marty probably doesn't remember this at all, but this was a profound moment for me. You probably don't even know it, but I had like a couple, like 2 or 3 A's that whatever the note was that I had written for Koto, and Marty said, instead of just plucking that, why don't you instead of the same string, why don't you use the different string, bend up to it, and use the same note? And I was like, oh wow, yeah, okay, that's going to give it a timbre. That's going to give it a little bit of a different intonation, right? Which just brings it to life, right? So, Marty, I've taken that idea and run with it for 20 years now.
Well, Don, I remember that moment.
Oh, do you?
I must say that I had the same moment like that 2 years beforehand when I started studying with Minoru Miki in Tokyo. I did a similar type of passage, and then he started talking about adjusting the strings and changing the timbre. So we can thank Minoru Miki for that.
Yeah. So, and I tell this to all my students, if you're writing for Kayaking and you write the same pitch 4 times in a row, those need to be 4 different notes, right? They can all be E flat, but it's got to be 4 different E flats, right? That's what these instruments are really good about doing. If you do that on the piano, it's not very interesting, right? So what? But if you do it on Kayaking, it can be down, doing, doing. That's interesting, right? So that sort of thing, I think, is a really important idea that Korean instruments in particular can do that Western instruments aren't nearly as good as doing that.
Yeah, and then like you just were influenced by Martin, I actually studied your score to learn about Korean Gugak orchestra because you did a wonderful job with Gugak orchestration. So actually the knowledge is being passed by. And speaking of which, how would you advise those who are interested in incorporating this? How difficult is it to learn a new culture or new instrument?
The most important thing is to have collaborators, have a performer who is willing to work with you, because that's where you're going to learn the instrument. The performer knows far more about their instrument than you ever will, right? So it's really important to work with them and learn from them on what sounds good with the instrument. Finding that connection is a difficult thing sometimes, and I've been very blessed to be here in Hawaii, where we have this program where we bring a lot of great performers of East Asian instruments through. So I've been able to develop a lot of professional connections, which I share with my students, right? So if you're a student in our program here, you have these tremendous opportunities. But if you're a student in Iowa or someplace, and you want to get into this, it's really difficult, right? One of the things that's difficult about it in the past, and it's changing now, is just access to the information, right? 10 years ago, if you wanted to write for Korean instruments and you don't speak Korean and you're not in Korea, good luck, right? How are you going to learn about the instruments, right? There's nothing out there. But there have been several good books that have come out in the last decade, and E.G. Young has a great book on Kayaking, right? So if you want to write for Kayaking, this is a gold mine right here, right, of knowledge and information. And now there have been many books on Piri and Kumungo and whatever else. And just a couple of years ago, and these are all in English as well as Korean. And just a couple of years ago, the National Kugak Center came out with a publication in both Korean and English, an instrumentation book for 2 different volumes of it, really. So they're professional performers who are writing about their instrument. If you want to compose for it, this is what you need to know about it, right? And I actually wrote a chapter for that book. I wrote an article on how to approach the Korean instruments from the perspective of a Western composer. You know, this is sort of how you get into it. So the resources are becoming much more available. YouTube and so forth, you can find just about anything now. So you can hear the instruments now, you know, 20 years ago, you couldn't. So it's a lot easier, but it's still important to make those personal connections, because that's how not only you're going to learn really about the instrument, but also how you're going to get performances, right? You've got to connect with performers.
Yes, wonderful. I am just sharing the website of Kugak, National Kugak Center, so that you can actually have an access to those information as well. And I'm really grateful to those who contributed to that publication. And final question. So I know you're very prolific, so I'm kind of curious about what you're currently writing during this pandemic.
So yeah, I actually had a really productive summer. I know the pandemic has been really hard on a lot of people, and I feel for them definitely, but I've been fortunate that I've been pretty sheltered here. No real problems so far. And it gave me the time over the summer. I just basically holed up in my office and composed a lot. So I ended up writing about 2 pieces of about 30 minutes of music this summer, a piece for violin and piano, and then a piece for 25-string Kayaking, which was commissioned by a performer in Seoul. And then right now I'm working on what is my Guggenheim project, which is a concerto for Kumungo for Ho Yoon-jung, who is a colleague of E.G. Young. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Wow, yeah, that's very exciting. And hope all the questions were answered. Is there any other question I missed? Okay, well, I really appreciate sharing your music. You will see lots of comments on Facebook as well, like fabulous music. And I also would love to thank the performers who are with us today, Jiyoung Yi and Suyeon Liu and Yoonjae Lee and everyone for your beautiful performances as well. And that was really perfect for Halloween, the Shaman music. Thank you for your contribution as well. And if you are interested in Donald Womack's music, please visit his website and please buy his CD released last year, Intertwined, available on various platforms. Next week, we have our first guest who lives in Boston, actually. So I am very excited to have Yoonjae Lee, Professor Yoonjae Lee, who teaches at Boston Conservatory. Would you want to just say hi briefly? I know you're here. Okay, she's there. She's muted. Sorry. Oh, Yoonjae, sorry, you're muted. Still muted. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So, hi, nice to meet you. And I look forward to our symposium next week. And I hope I can bring interesting music to you. Yes. So.
I'm sure it's going to be another amazing presentation. And thank you for being with us today. And let's give one more round of applause to Dr. Womack.
And Dr. Womack, thank you so much for your wonderful music. Yeah,
Thank you.
It's really inspiring. Thank you.
Yeah. So happy Halloween, and I hope you stay happy, healthy, and musical.
Thank you, Teksu. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.